This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
I think one of the trademarks of anyone of a nerdy persuasion is the sheer pleasure one gets in discovering and cataloging the references found in one's favorite works of art. It's one of the reasons why I love playing Final Fantasy, for instance, just seeing what random obscure references the games throw into the series' history. Likewise, when I was doing research for my video on Otaku no Video, that sounds fucking awkward, video on Otaku no Video, I had to reread Anime Ego's incredible liner notes and was reminded how much I miss those kinds of things, and wish more companies would put the time and effort into putting them together. But if the companies aren't going to do it, I suppose I will. And what the hell, I might as well take the plunge and choose one of the most complex subjects possible for a project like this. As the title implies, this series is a guide to the myriad references found in Xenogears. Now, as you all know, Xenogears has a ton of references to a ton of different subjects. Religion, psychology, philosophy, anime, film, science, history, and it's my goal to catalog all these references and tell you what they all mean, both their real-world definitions and what the greater significance they may have in Xenogears itself. This is a tricky proposition. Some of Xenogears' references are just there for flavor, but others have obvious thematic connections to the story, and it's not always immediately apparent which one is which, but I'm going to try my best to make those distinctions. Before we begin, though, a couple of points. First, about spoilers. A video like this, by necessity, has to spoil the entire game, so if you haven't played Xenogears yet,
stop this video now.
Xenogears has one of the most powerful and moving stories in the history of video games, and I would hate if my video inadvertently spoiled it for you. That being said, in the video itself, I'm not going to be spoiling anything past the point that I'm discussing. I'll give an example so you know what I mean. The opening cutscene. Those of you who have played Xenogears know that there are a ton of references that aren't going to be explained until the very, very end of the game. I'm not going to spoil those references right off the bat. I'll spoil them later in the game once we get the proper context for those references. Does that make sense? Alright, cool. Second, I want to make clear that these videos are only cataloging the references in the game script itself. I won't be cataloging anything in Perfect Works, because that would make this series way longer than it already is. I will, of course, consult Perfect Works if something in the game's script requires clarification. Third, if you're watching these videos expecting some kind of in-depth reading of the entire story, that's not what I'm going to be doing here. All I'm doing is cataloging and explaining the references. Some of those references, by their nature, will require some interpretive work on my end, but the primary purpose of these videos are to be explanatory and not analytical. Lastly, though I'm calling this series the Complete Xenogears Reference Guide, I understand before I even start that that's something of a foolish choice. There are so many references in this game to so many esoteric subjects that I'm almost certainly going to overlook stuff, and I'm almost certainly going to get stuff wrong. I want you to point these things out to me in the comments. If there's enough of them, I'll make an addendum video discussing those corrections and credit whoever it was that pointed them out to me. Alright, let's get this ridiculous idea underway. The references hit you as soon as you start a new game. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. This is a line from the Book of Revelation, specifically chapter 22, verse 13. In context, the line is spoken by Christ to John of Patmos after showing him a vision of the New Jerusalem. Alpha and Omega are, of course, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, so Christ is saying, in a couple different ways, that he's in command of both the beginning of creation and the end of time. Thus, the quote suggests both divine power and a sense of finality, but obviously it's too soon to tell what this means in the context of the story. It must mean something, though, as the bridge operators aboard the spaceship reference beings called Alpha 1 and Omega 1. The translation, unfortunately, somewhat obscures the meaning, as they speak as if Alpha 1 and Omega 1 are other members of the crew, when this is not the case. Alpha 1 and Omega 1 are in fact two hostile beings coordinating an all-out attack on the ship. It's interesting, therefore, that these hostile forces are co-opting the identity of Christ, but again, as of now, we don't know why. The being called Alpha-1 begins a process called Genome Restructuring. The crew confirms Exon replacement, and the fact that the base code seems to be growing at an overwhelming rate. Genome Restructuring, Exon replacement, base code, all these are terms used in molecular biology, specifically in DNA replication. The genome refers to the genetic makeup of a living organism. The exon specifically refers to the part of a gene that will become part of mRNA after the introns have been excised, and while the base code could refer to the genetic code as a whole, additionally, there is a term in computer science called code base that refers to the complete source code of a computer program. Taken together, all this suggests some sort of dangerous organism is mutating fast. Alpha-1 begins to hack into the ship's supercomputer, Raziel Central. As befitting the name of a supercomputer, Raziel is the name of an angel from the Kabbalistic tradition. His name literally means God is my mystery, and he's said to be privy to all the secrets of heaven because he stands in such close proximity to God. Tradition grants him authorship of an obscure religious text apparently called the Book of Raziel the Angel, which was said to have been given to Adam and Eve after they ate the fruit from the Tree of Knowledge. In response to this, the bridge operator initializes something called FakeNet. Now, I gotta thank the folks over at the Retrograde Amnesia podcast for cluing me in on this one, since, thanks to an inaccurate transcription of the game's script on GameFAQs, most people think that she's saying FaTech, which is not a real thing. FakeNet, in fact, is a means of trying to capture a hacker in a fake network and isolating it, rendering the hacking attempt a failure. Sadly, the attempt doesn't work, forcing the captain to try a manual disruption. And about the captain. I don't think this is mentioned here, but according to Perfect Works, his real name is Shigeyoshi Inoue. Shigeyoshi Inoue was a real person, an admiral in the Imperial Navy who served until the end of World War II. He's primarily remembered for two things: a strong advocacy for naval aviation, and for his opposition to Japan's embrace of militarism and fascism prior to the beginning of the war. I'm not sure why his name specifically was chosen, other than he's an important military figure who doesn't seem like he was a complete shitbag, and perhaps it's just that simple. In response to the hacking attempt, the operators inform the captain that the ship's autopilot system, Faust, has been activated. Faust is the name of a legendary figure based on the 15th century German doctor Johann Georg Faust, a scholar who supposedly sold his soul to the devil, usually referred to in the legend as Mephistopheles, for both knowledge and worldly pleasure. The Faust legend has been subject to a number of great literary adaptations throughout the centuries, most famously in the dramatic adaptations of English playwright Christopher Marlowe and the legendary German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The mere fact the autopilot system has this name suggests that wherever the ship is going, it's not going to end well. The operators then announce that the phase space logic is being rewritten, and the Ergo area is increasing. These are both terms drawn from astrophysics. Phase space, and I'm shamelessly going to pilfer the definition from Wikipedia because the physical sciences are not my area of expertise, is a space in which all possible states of a dynamical system or a control system are represented, with each possible state corresponding to one unique point. The Ergo area, derived from the Greek word ergon, meaning work, refers to the region outside the event horizon of a black hole. This suggests the ship is preparing to enter hyperspace by using a black hole as a propulsion system, a common trope in science fiction stories. As a last-ditch effort, the captain evacuates the ship, which backfires spectacularly when the weapons systems are taken over and proceed to shoot the escape pods out of the sky. While the captain watches in horror, an ominous message begins to scroll across every screen on the bridge: "You shall be as gods." This is another biblical quote, this time from Genesis chapter 3 verse 5, the full verse in question being, "For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." In context, the quote is spoken by the serpent to Eve in the Garden of Eden. In fact, it's this line in particular that convinces Eve to eat of the fruit of the Tree of Knowledge, leading to her and Adam's expulsion from paradise. This is confusing. The scene began with a quote from the triumphant Christ from Revelation, and now it's being punctuated by a quote from the serpent from Genesis. What we're supposed to make of this, again, is something that can't be answered right now. In the end, the ship crash lands on an unknown planet, the only survivor seeming to be a naked woman who looks impossibly beautiful for having just survived this crash. Another mystery that's not to be answered now. The scene ends and transitions to a text dump summarizing a centuries-long war between two world powers. This text dump seems to be suggesting two of Xenogears' primary sources of inspiration. Star Wars, whose text scroll introductions are among the most famous in cinematic history, and the anime series Mobile Suit Gundam, whose early episodes begin with a narration summarizing the conflict between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is an awful lot to extrapolate from a simple text dump, and ordinarily I'd be right there with you. The reason why I feel comfortable mentioning it now is because there's multitudes of evidence that the Xenogears team were profoundly influenced by those two sources. In the case of Star Wars, Square Games had been including blatant references to the series for years, most famously with the recurring appearances of characters named Biggs and Wedge in the Final Fantasy series. Hell, one of the antagonists in Final Fantasy IX actually quotes Yoda from The Phantom Menace, for crying out loud. As for Gundam, the fact that Xenogears director Tetsuya Takahashi is a mecha otaku is well documented, and beyond that, he has a special affinity for Gundam in particular. There's a famous anecdote from Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi where he says that as soon as Takahashi got the green light to form his own team and create Xenogears, he covered his desk with Gundam models. All this to say, Star Wars and Gundam are two of the team's biggest influences. This is far from the last shout out to either franchise we're going to encounter, and this text dump, implicit as it may be, is there to announce it. Alright, let's go on. The war the text dump speaks of takes place on the continent of Ignas. This introduces a theme. The name of the world's continents are all derived from the Latin names of the four elements. Ignis, in this case, deriving from Ignis, meaning fire, appropriate for a continent embroiled in war. The two nations at war are called Kislev and Aveh. These names introduce another theme. The nations of the world are, by and large, named after the months of the Jewish calendar. Kislev, specifically, is named after the 9th month, which roughly corresponds to about November or December in the Gregorian calendar, and Aveh is named after Av, the 5th month, corresponding to about July or August. Nobody seems to be entirely sure why they're named in this way. To the best anyone understands, it's just because they sound exotic. Aveh may have a greater thematic significance, however. The Babylonian Talmud says our joy is diminished with regards to the month of Av because a lot of bad things have historically happened to the Jewish people in that month. The 9th of Av, specifically, is the traditional date of the destruction of both the first and second temples. This would seem to fit the nation of Aveh, where the game will spend most of its time and will come to suffer unfathomable tragedies in the hours ahead. The war takes a dark turn when giant humanoid mechs called Gears are excavated, thanks to the efforts of a worldwide religious and cultural organization called the Ethos.
In the original Japanese script,
Ethos is simply called the Church. I'm assuming the name was changed because the English localizer, Richard Honeywood, was concerned about offending Christian audiences in the West. Ethos, by the way, is taken from a Greek word meaning character. It's the root of the English word ethics. While Kislev benefited most from the discovery of these gears, given that there were more buried in their territory, Aveh gets a much-needed boost from a military organization called Gebler. Gebler is a reference to Gevurah, the 5th of the 10 Sephiroth, or emanations of God, in the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Gevurah represents the strength and stern judgment of God, a good name for a military force. After this introduction, we're brought to the tiny village of Lahan and introduced to our protagonist, Fei Fong Wong. Fei's name is a reference to Wong Fei Hong, an actual Chinese folk hero of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who is a master of the martial art of Hung Ga and opened a famous medical clinic in the city of Guangzhou. He's probably best known to people outside China for being a character in a number of famous Chinese films. He's been played by Jet Li in 1991's Once Upon a Time in China, and by Jackie Chan in the Drunken Master series. Like the historical Wong Fei Hong, Fei in Xenogears is also a master of martial arts. Fei's closest friends in the village are Alice and Timothy, who are engaged to be married, and Alice's little brother Dan. All three names are religious references. Timothy, which is a Greek name meaning either God's honor or honored by God, was the right-hand man of St. Paul, and 2 books of the New Testament are credited to him, though he probably didn't actually write either one. It doesn't seem to have any sort of significance to the character in Xenogears. The same can be said for Alice, though it must be mentioned that her name was actually changed for the English script. In Japanese, Alice is called Aruru, who is a Mesopotamian goddess of vegetation best known for creating the wild man Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have no idea what, if anything, this is supposed to mean, if it's even supposed to reference the Mesopotamian Aruru at all, or why her name was changed for the English script, other than perhaps because it sounds more natural to an English speaker. Finally, Dan's name is a reference to the biblical character of the same name, the fifth child of Jacob and his handmaid Bilhah, who became the ancestor to one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, I think the reference is just there for flavor. There's one more important person living in Lahan Village. Look around and you'll find Lucca, one of the main characters from Square's legendary 1995 RPG Chrono Trigger. Many on the Xenogears team had previously worked on Chrono Trigger. Aside from Takahashi, the most notable include composer Yasunori Mitsuda and scenario writer Masato Kato. In fact, before Xenogears became its own property, it was developed as a potential sequel to Chrono Trigger, which is certainly why the two games share so many team members. It should be noted that many on the Xenogears team would, in fact, go on to create the actual sequel to Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, after Xenogears was finished. Alright, let's move on. Fei is tasked with traveling up the mountain to borrow a camera from Lahan's resident doctor, Citan Uzuki. Now, the first thing we gotta do here is clear up an important point of contention, the pronunciation of Citan's name. Personally, I've heard it said a number of different ways. Citan, Citan, etc. In Japanese, his name is written this way in katakana, meaning the correct pronunciation is Shitan. Indeed, art assets around his house spell his name, in English, transliterated from the katakana, as S-H-I-T-A-N, which was changed to C-I-T-A-N in the final script for reasons that should be obvious to everyone. In English, the name suggests shaitan, an Arabic word for devil, and the cognate of the more familiar Satan. Both Christian and Islamic traditions have a figure, whom I'm just going to refer to as Satan for the sake of simplicity, who is an angel cast out of heaven for rebelling against God. Why this man in particular should have this name is something we're going to have to come back to later. As for his last name, Uzuki is an old word for the month of April, and was used as the name of two separate destroyers by the Imperial Navy in the early 20th century. One more thing about Citan, he also seems to have inherited some of the traits of Wang Feihong, specifically in the fact that he operates a medical clinic, but it should also be noted that he's no slouch when it comes to martial arts either. Later that day, when Citan reflects on the imminence of Alice and Timothy's wedding, he says it might be better to remain in this condition, to live as a son of man. Son of man is a phrase found in a number of different places in the Bible, and what it means varies depending on where it's used. We first see it in the writings of the prophet Ezekiel. God often refers to Ezekiel as son of man, and the context makes it clear that he's simply referring to him as a human being. Things get more complicated when we get to the book of Daniel, where Daniel has the following vision. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and there was given to him dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom which shall not be destroyed. This makes the Son of Man some kind of messianic figure, a meaning which seems to carry over to the New Testament. Jesus uses the phrase often, but what exactly he means when he says it is something that's been the subject of scholarly debate for centuries. Citan's use of it here seems closest to that of Ezekiel. That is, he's envious of those who can live a normal life as a regular human. He seems to be aware of some sort of impending disaster in their midst, and of course, his intuitions couldn't be more accurate. A group of Gears attack Lahan in cold blood. Fei gets into an abandoned gear to fight them off, but in the process, he unleashes a power that destroys the entire village and most of its people, including both Alice and Timothy. As a result, Fei is banished, and Citan convinces him to travel through Blackmoon Forest into Aveh territory. In the forest, he encounters a woman who says it's her mission to kill all surface dwellers, or lambs, she encounters. Lambs, of course, are commonly associated with sacrifice in the biblical tradition, so this speaks volumes about what she thinks of the surface dwellers. We learn that this woman's name is Elhaym Van Houten, or Ellie for short. Elhaym Van Houten, as you can probably tell just from me saying it, is a name that's overflowing with meaning. Her first name, Elhaym, suggests both Elohim, a word that can refer to both gods in the plural as well as the God of Israel specifically, but also L'chaim, a traditional Hebrew toast that literally means to life. As for her last name, Van Houten is a real Dutch surname, referring to the city of Houten in the province of Utrecht. but translated literally, it means from the wood, an appropriate name for a woman encountered in the middle of the woods. As to the significance of her first name, it will surprise nobody that I'm going to have to come back to this later. After some rather emotional conversation, Citan returns Fei's gear, just in time for him to use it to defeat a giant Rankar. Citan reveals the gear's name to be Weltall, which is a German word meaning universe or cosmos. And since we're talking about gears again, I think this is as good a time as any to pause to talk about Takahashi's borrowing from Gundam. Even at this early stage, we can see how profoundly he's been influenced by that franchise. The Gundam series that's perhaps given the most to Xenogears is 1994's G Gundam. There's actually an interview with Takahashi where he's asked, straight up, if he's a fan of G Gundam. While he didn't give a verbal response, he did smile to the interviewer, which is basically a yes in all but name. Sadly, while I tried really hard to relocate the interview in question, I wasn't able to find it. If anyone watching knows where it is, please link it to me in the comments. Anyway, the entire idea of giant robots fighting in hand-to-hand combat is something borrowed wholesale from G Gundam, and there are plenty more specific references that I'll get to later. The second major Gundam reference encountered thus far is drawn from the 1979 original TV series, specifically the fact that Fei's initial character arc seems to be copied from that of Gundam's protagonist, Amuro Ray. Putting the two side by side really drives home their similarities. Both protagonists live in a world ravaged by a devastating war, but grow up in a remote area that's mostly removed from the heart of the conflict. In the midst of a surprise attack on their home, each hero manages to take command of a giant robot, one that has powers far and away greater than most others. Each is surprisingly adept at piloting said robot, but eventually does something that causes massive collateral damage and seriously injures their loved ones without their knowing about it. The trauma of war causes them to constantly avoid wanting to return to the cockpit, but they're drawn back time and again. And if I may jump ahead a bit, each protagonist eventually comes to find meaning in this new life as a soldier, and remains a pilot to the end. Given Takahashi's open admittance to being a Gundam otaku, I find these parallels far too close and numerous to be a coincidence. Alright, so that's part 1 of the complete Xenogears reference guide. This video ended up taking months and months and months of writing and researching, and the final script turned out to be something like 45 pages long, which is by far the longest script for anything I've ever worked on. So obviously I'm not going to release it all in one, long thing, because it's way too long and too dense for that. So I'm going to cut it up, release it in parts, and yeah, so if you liked what you saw here, there's going to be more coming out for the foreseeable future. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and like I said, make note of any omissions or errors that I made, and when I'm all done with this, I will put out an addendum video and give you guys credit. Alright, see you guys later.